Thank you, sir. I'm very pleased to move the motion standing in my name, that the House notes the proposed restructure to research and collections at the South Australian Museum, including the significant reduction in scientific and research staff. That this House notes this proposed strategic direction and reimagining of the galleries at the South Australian Museum, including the refusal of the museum's leadership to rule out abolishing popular galleries, including the Mammals, the Egyptian Room, the Polar Collection and more. C urges the government to reverse recent budget cuts imposed on the museum by the Malinowskis Labor government, and indeed to increase funding to the level that the museum can fulfil its legislated scientific functions. And D urges the government to cancel the proposed restructure and reimagining at the South Australian Museum. So I intend to set out as briefly as I can the background and circumstances addressing this motion and look forward to the contributions of other members on the matter. The South Australian Museum is a beloved and cherished institution in South Australia. It plays a tremendously important role in examining our natural history, both from the South Australian point of view, but also from a broader global perspective. The scientific researchers at the museum cover a wide range of disciplines. There are 27 people that are proposed to have their roles cut as a result of the restructure proposition that has had significant amount of public debate in recent months. Those 27 roles have collectively more than 470 years of experience in such roles. This is not a body of experience and expertise that can be replaced easily, nor, sir, is it one that can be fixed later should they be let go now. I acknowledge that as a result of some of the circumstances which I'll go through in a moment, the government has instigated a review of the matter, being conducted by the Chief Executive of the Department of Premier and Cabinet, with support from the South Australian Chief Scientist and the Director of Museums in Queensland. Noting that the museum is a statutory authority reporting to DPC effectively, we consider this to be in effect an internal review, paying no criticism of the expertise, particularly of the two scientists who are contributing to that. And I look forward to that. I think it is a good thing that the Premier has noticed there's an issue here and has sought advice. But the opposition does not believe that that review is in itself sufficient, which is why we are moving this motion, which is why we are calling for the government to take further steps, and in the meantime, why opposition members, along with the Greens, I note, on the Statutory Authorities Review Committee, have instigated of their own motion a further review, a parliamentary inquiry, independent of DPC, with an opportunity for transparency and, I guess, the confidence of those stakeholders who have significant concerns about the museum's plans. Let's take a step back. Why are we here? Look, the museum, the South Australian Museum, despite enormous work over more than a century in terms of its scientific research, its public programs, its exhibitions and displays that are available free of charge to the public to participate in, and indeed which have been cherished by generations of families, this institution is largely funded by the South Australian Government. It has philanthropic support, notably from some particular donors who have put in millions over the years, and also from businesses. But it's fair to say that the operations of the museum are very much a function of the budget they receive from the South Australian Government. Now, successive governments have applied at times efficiency dividends, or as some people would put it, cuts to the budget. The most recent of these, in the 2022 state budget by the Malinowskis Labor government upon coming to office, have been in the order of hundreds of thousands of dollars, a hit to the operating budget of the museum. At a time, might I say, Mr. Acting Deputy Speaker, where the museum and the rest of society has confronted significant increases in costs. An escalation in the costs of living, the cost of doing business in South Australia, which is being felt around every kitchen table, around every boardroom, around every accountant's office, and indeed every single institution in this state over the last 2 years. To the point where, as I understand it, at one stage in 2022-23, it looked like the museum board was facing a deficit of more than $1 billion in their operations. which was, as I understand it, reduced to less than $750,000 as a result of efficiencies applied or potentially expenses deferred, and some support from Treasury got over the line, as I understand it, that year. Now, that's notwithstanding that there were efficiencies, which I'm sure the Minister will take us through in the 2018 and 2019 budgets. I've heard this from the government before. The suggestion was made by the Premier on ABC Radio as if those efficiencies were the only efficiencies that had ever confronted the museum. The truth is that those efficiencies came on top of, and I think were radically exacerbated by, in the figures quoted by the government, previous efficiencies from 2017 and before that were still baked into those figures. No one has come to this debate about the museum with clean hands as it comes to the budget, but we are focused on the future. I also make the point, sir, that when it comes to investment in the museum, both operating and capital should be taken into account. And the former Marshall Liberal government, notwithstanding the efficiencies in 2018 and 2019, invested more than $80 million in a capital project that would both reduce the operating expenses of the museum through its storage expenses, but really significantly and most importantly would be a fit-for-purpose environment to store the priceless collections of the museum. Aboriginal and First Nations heritage items that are utterly priceless. Significant collections which are currently and have been shamefully stored for decades in rented facilities that are not appropriate, not fit for purpose. That cultural collection storage facility, which would also have benefited, which hopefully will also benefit the State History Collection and the Art Gallery, was due to be completed soon. It's been delayed. There's been a challenge to the reduction scope. I note there's been, I believe, some funding provided by the government to cope with some cost escalations, but I still have questions about whether that's going to be enough to fulfil the scope. The point is that that investment of more than $80 million tenfold outweighs any efficiency is applied during that former time. Where are we now? We've got 27 research positions that are to be restructured out of existence, and the museum's instigation of these is not, I believe, on a whim. I think it is a direct response to their budget situation. And that is why this motion, as the opposition has called for, calls for a reinstatement first of the budget cuts from 2022 to give the Museum Board the courage and the financial confidence they need to be able to proceed without these wide-scale cuts to staffing. As I understand it, the proposed restructure would reduce the staffing allocation by $500,000. The Minister can correct me if I'm wrong, but the 27 positions to be removed, to be replaced with 23 curatorial positions, as I understand it, the difference in expense is in the order of $500,000. That's a bit more than was cut from the budget in 2022, but the 2022 budget cuts are a good start. We believe that the reviews, whether it's the Premier's review or the parliamentary inquiry or both, will be very useful in ensuring that we can have an understanding of the budget investment that is going to be required going forward, which may be above that cut in the 2022 budget, and we think that is useful and important work. The Liberal Party commits to providing such an investment, at least to the level of the cut budget in 2022 and potentially more. The reason I'm so confident of the connection between the budget cuts and indeed the review of research and collections is because I've gone to the trouble of reading the board minutes, sir. And I thank those dutiful officers within the South Australian Museum who so expertly and assiduously respond to our FOI inquiries, and I am grateful for their professionalism in undertaking this, I'm sure, tedious work, but it is important work. In February 2023, I note that the Chair of the Board acknowledged that the Board had agreed to pause the review of research strategy and restructure at the December Board meeting, however advised the Board were now considering the best timing to start the process. They agreed the new director should be involved in the decision and agreed to proceed once the preference is known. In March, the Chair noted the process had begun with Chris Daniels chairing that review. In April, Chris Daniels reported to the Board on what work was being undertaken and stressed the importance of a 360-degree process which invites museum staff from other departments to contribute. In May, Chris Daniels provided the Board with an update, and indeed, in July, there was a full day of interviews held with researchers. The minutes note that the review has been insightful. Members now have substantial relevant information. The committee expressed their thanks to all research and collection staff who participated. This is a review that largely took place over the first 6 months of last year. Around the end of this time, the new director was appointed, and in September, the new director reported to the board the key points of his review, what had by this stage become his review, as was clarified later in Budget and Finance, and his recommendations for the proposed organisational restructure. He said, according to the minutes, that it was noted the planned restructure not only delivers clear strategic benefits, but also delivers financial savings that address the current budget deficit. It was said in the minutes, it was agreed the paper would form the basis of a briefing document for meetings with the Minister, DPC and DTF to gain approval for the proposed restructure. It said in the minutes this briefing would also outline the support required by the museum, including a dedicated and experienced change management resource from DPC to run the project, funding to cover the direct costs of the restructure, and interim funding to cover the operating deficits of the museum until such time as the new structure is in operation. These 3 points we have asked repeatedly about because it has been suggested by the Premier that all of this work was done by the Museum Board in isolation of government, as if the museum was not a statutory authority reporting to a minister with the director of the museum responsible as a public servant to a deputy chief executive of DPC herself. The museum, according to the Premier's logic, is almost an absentee institution from government. This is not the case, of course, sir. The museum, like TAFE SA, like SA Water, like so many other statutory authorities, is indeed a part of government with a different management process, and indeed a board that has an important role to play, but which does not do so in isolation of government. The September board minutes make that very clear. That connection, that requirement, that engagement with DPC and DTF very clear. Further, we understand that the Minister was provided a briefing endorsed before Christmas and that the Department of Premier and Cabinet were intimately involved. The Director of the Museum confirmed at Budget and Finance that DPC did provide support for that change management resource. The idea that the Premier's own department was providing functional support to the museum for its restructure and review, and yet the Premier says that it was absent from government is a nonsense. And that is why he now has an obligation to actually put this to an end once and for all. Throughout October, November and December, the museum is understood to have continued this work with government, with DTF, with DPC and indeed the Minister. In February, in 26th of February, the museum announced its restructure, which provoked a lot of the public response and commentary. And indeed, we also have plans that have been provided to the public and indeed members of opposition as well, showing what the strategic plan would do for the museum's physical footprint. Now, it's my understanding that all of this would have been encapsulated in briefings and discussions provided to the Minister, provided to DTF and DPC. It's certainly what I'd read from the board minutes, but I'd make the further point that if those plans were not part of briefings to the Minister and DTF and DPC prior to indeed their public release last week, then I would be utterly stunned. The Premier has said repeatedly, sir, that the government has no plans, that there have been no plans to restructure the museum's physical environment, to reimagine the museum's physical environment in a way that would, as has been suggested, remove anything non-South Australian, which would include, presumably, the International Mammals Gallery, which would include, presumably, the Egyptian Room, the polar collections, the range of minerals that do not bear particular geographic connection to South Australia. Some do, of course, but not all. Now, the Premier, in saying that there are no plans, has been really caught wanting in the last week when those plans were released. And I think the Premier's only response from here is to do 3 things. Firstly, to restore the budget that has been taken from the museum in 2022. I'm very much open to suggestions of an increase on that, as I have outlined earlier. The museum probably would do well to have more than the money that was just that extra cut in 2022. Secondly, the restructure that puts those scientific researchers' jobs at risk needs to not just be paused pending a review, but absolutely ruled out going forward, so that those 27 people can go into winter confident their jobs will still exist. And thirdly, the reimagining needs to be cancelled because, sir, the opposition would welcome and would support significant improvements to the galleries and exhibition spaces at the museum, but the proposals that have been put forward and now publicly released, we do not believe are in keeping with the traditions and the best opportunities for the future of the museum. Let's take them off the shelf altogether.
Order, the member's time has expired. Are there any further speakers on the motion? The Minister.
Thank you, Mr Acting Speaker. I rise to speak on the member's motion and indicate that we will not be supporting this motion. I've got to say, Mr Acting Speaker, it's an interesting motion. From my perspective, it's appreciative that the member now admits that those opposite don't come with clean hands to this debate. But what we have seen is certainly a scare campaign that's been promulgated from those opposite, really catching on to the fear of the museums community, which really is not founded on facts, and I just want to be clear on that. The House, Mr Acting Speaker, would be well aware of the Malinauskas government's position on the museum now. The Premier and I, as indicated by the member for Moriata, have paused the restructure. We've been in discussions with a number of people who have expressed concerns over the changes, and certainly the museum leadership as well. I do want to indicate, however, that neither the Premier nor I are indicating that I certainly was not briefed on this. I was. In fact, the briefing that I received in January on the reimagining I thought was sufficiently important that I requested that the member for Moriata also be briefed, which he was in February. So there is some level of feigned outrage at the moment on those briefings, which I just draw to the attention of this place. What we have done is put that restructure on hold, which is one of the reasons we will not be supporting a motion that talks about the proposed restructure and proposed reimagining until the experts that have formed part of that Premier's Review panel have done their work. As the member for Moriata indicated, that panel comprises of the Chief Executive of DPC, but also our Chief Scientist, Professor Craig Simmons, and Dr Jim Thompson, who's from the Queensland Museum, Chief Executive. We are seeking advice on a range of matters through this panel, including around research functions, curatorial capabilities, repatriation and engagement with First Nations communities, collections management, public engagement, contemporary approaches to displays and exhibitions, and public access to the collection, including through digitisation, contemporary approaches to how the museum can provide opportunities for educating and knowledge sharing aligned with our curriculum and our early learning frameworks in particular, and delivering public value to the people of South Australia, ensuring that the museum does utilise its resources to deliver the best possible outcomes that it can for its audiences. It's a significant review. It's covering a significant amount of issues that will then guide us as government as to what future options there are for the museum. But I can confirm once again that there have been no decisions to get rid of anything. The proposed reimagining was simply to go to public consultation. There were no decisions to remove Egyptian rooms or mammals galleries or anything else. And as the member for Moriata would have it, the Premier and I should have stopped any consultation. I think that is really the guts of it. With no decisions being made, the alternative proposition is for me to sit in a meeting with Dr Gamester and the chair of the board and say, no, please don't talk to anyone about anything ever, which really is not the point of it. And when the member opposite expresses concerns with what some of those strategic visions were around education, I find as the shadow member for education to think it would be somehow extraordinary that the museum would want an education hub, would want to progress and strengthen education ties. I think is quite remarkable that we shouldn't even have the conversation about whether that is appropriate or not. And of course the member does touch on the funding issues, and of course there was, I can fully acknowledge $300,000 of efficiency savings in this financial year from our very first budget, a budget that we were required to undertake significant budget repair of the 4 years of the Marshall Liberal government. But that pales in consideration to what is in this current financial year $1.2 million less as a result of the first 2 budgets of the Marshall Liberal government. Of the first 2 Marshall Liberal government budgets, $1.2 million less is now received for the museum in this current financial year. Now, I also want to indicate that at the last election, there was very little offered by those opposite for arts and culture in South Australia. What we do have now is, within 2 years, an additional $72 million in funding for arts and culture through election commitments, including $8 million to support our small and medium arts organisations and our artists through fellowships and commissions and other programs. Of course, $8 million to the Adelaide Fringe, annualising the film festival with an extra $2 million, plus an extra $2 million to the Adelaide Film Festival Investment Fund for producing local works. Our See It Live campaign, $35 million for the Adelaide Festival Centre, $2.3 million out of major events for our Adelaide Festival, $5.2 million to SAFC to support an ABC partnership, encouraging more television production here in South Australia. That additional $72 million in the last 2 years indicates how high a priority arts and culture is to the Malin Alcest government, and the museum in no way would ever be put at risk for its world-class collections. The government is incredibly proud of its collections and the museum, and it is a beloved cultural institution in our state. Our museum holds the largest and most comprehensive collection of Aboriginal cultural material in the world. We need to share that with South Australians, we need to share that with the world. We need to ensure our diverse natural and cultural history is told through our museum. No moves will be made to put these collections and those stories at risk, and for these reasons, Mr Acting Speaker, we will not be supporting this motion from the member from Oriata.
Further speakers? Member for Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. I too rise to say that this motion is completely unnecessary. Just last month, I had a fantastic day, actually. I asked my little boy, he was turning 5, it was his 5th birthday, and I asked him what would he like to do. And no surprises, he said that he wanted to spend the day at the museum. And so it's a favourite of my children, as I know it is for so many children in my community and across South Australia. It was a beautiful day. We did what we always do. We go and watch the old lion and wait for its tail to twitch, as I'm sure many parents have done numerous times. We then, of course, go and visit the big squid. We go up and stick our fingers on that big block of ice on one of the other floors and go and look at all the mineral collections. My kids just absolutely love the museum, and so does our government. And very pleased to see the Arts Minister and the Premier undertake the Premier's review. The findings and recommendations of this review will be handed to the Premier and the Arts Minister by the middle of the year. So once again, we see a sense of déjà vu, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. It seems that no institution on North Terrace is immune to the opposition in an attempt at relevancy to grab onto any issue, grab an A-frame, grab a petition and stand out the front of some of our beloved institutions. We saw it, of course, with the Adelaide Botanic Gardens, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, spreading significant lies and misinformation and causing a lot of distress to staff, particularly staff at the Adelaide Botanic Gardens. And once again, we're seeing the same MO here with our beloved museum, standing out the front with an A-frame and a clipboard, taking people's information, spreading misinformation and concern in our community. The fact is that, as the Arts Minister was saying, this is an opposition that was, when in last in government, cut more than $1 million in their first to Marshall Liberal budgets. They have no concern for the museum. They are simply playing politics with this issue, because the fact is our museum is part of a series of institutions that we love and that we cherish, and a significant investment in arts and culture in our state. As the Arts Minister was saying, $72.5 million in additional investment. You know, $8 million for the Adelaide Fringe, $2 million to make the Adelaide Film Festival an annual event, $10 million to support the live music industry through our See It Live campaign. I'll mention that a lot of those grants that were recently handed out by the Arts Minister were in the CBD, recognising the significant cultural value that those live music venues provide for the Adelaide community. We've got $35 million to upgrade the Adelaide Festival Centre, $2.3 million for the Adelaide Festival, $5.2 million in partnership with the ABC to support more television productions in South Australia. That one's particularly important given the ABC building is in my electorate in the suburb of Collinswood. The opposition clearly have no issues in spreading this information when it continues to suit their false narrative. We're seeing this time and time again. I'm not sure which North Terrace institution is next on their hit list, but I certainly will not be supporting this motion today.
Further speakers? If the member speaks, he closes debate. Member for Morialta.
Thank you. I thank members for contributing to the debate. I know that many more would like to have spoken, the member for Bragg and the member for Unley in particular, but time is against us today. I note their particular concern, along with all members of the opposition. The Minister and the member for Adelaide have suggested the opposition has feigned outrage, or indeed spreading misinformation is the accusation used by the member, well, by both of them at different times and the Premier before. This is from the same party, of course, sir, that said there were no plans to get rid of any of the galleries. The plans clearly, having been released, show that those galleries, having been described, were not part of the reimagining of the museum. And I thank the Minister for offering me a briefing in February. At that briefing, I made it very clear that I had no intention of revealing any confidential information provided at the briefing unless the same information was provided to me by other sources, and I have held true to that commitment. Other sources have provided me with information that has been consistent with the information I received at that briefing, and subsequent to that, I've been happy to talk about it. I think it's useful for governments and opposition to be able to engage with the level of trust that information provided at government briefings, if it needs to be confidential or if it's sought to be confidential, as certainly was the impression I got from the Museum Board, saying that they were not proposing to release that detail until April. I wanted to honour that commitment. So, the $72 million claimed as new investments for the arts by the Minister, I point out, is not a net figure. That is the figure that was committed to new projects. You can net off tens of millions of dollars in efficiencies, such as from the museum and most of the cultural institutions on North Terrace, and the Festival Centre, I suppose that's on North Terrace too, and a range of other cuts from that 2022 budget. I'd also, the member for Adelaide highlighted the $10 million live music commitment by the government, $5 million of which is never ever going to be spent because it's been locked up in a COVID shutdown fund, that effectively an insurance fund for venues that will only ever be spent if there is further COVID-related lockdowns that prevent events from going forward. So I think it's beyond time that the government can claim credit for a $10 million fund unless they're suggesting that that $5 million from the lockdown fund is going to be applied to other things. What I'm expressing, sir, is when the government talks about misinformation being provided, they should be very careful in how they do so, lest they be accused of the same. They said there were no plans, and then plans were released. They've said they've spent all this money on arts and live music, and yet much of it has been netted off against efficiencies or cuts, and indeed half of the live music fund appears never to be likely to be spent. The budget repair, finally, that the Minister talks of in defending the cuts to the museum, the budget repair that she said after 4 years of the Marshall Liberal government, it's remarkable that I have to do this, that I have to remind the House that for 2020 until 2022, the entire world was consumed by an extraordinary once-in-a-century pandemic that required greater than usual expenditure in order to ensure that people were kept alive, that people were able to retain jobs. I sometimes am confronted by this question of, well, why didn't the Marshall Liberal government do this, or why didn't the Marshall Liberal government do that? And I just have to remind people, between February 2020 and February 2022, there are not that many people in the world who were moving around too much or doing many interesting things. And I ask the question, given that you were likely to be in one place in the world for that period of time, where in the world would you rather have been than South Australia, benefiting from the world's best health outcomes and some of the world's most flexible and free, lack of limitation on movement, a state where we lost 7 days of schooling due to lockdowns, completely unmatched by any other jurisdiction in this country, let alone elsewhere in the world. And the support provided to the arts during that time, including the more than $80 million invested in the generationally significant cultural collection storage facility, which this government has yet to deliver on, is quite frankly worthy of more than a description of budget repair needed, as the Arts Minister puts forward. I commend the motion to the House, sir.
Question before the chair is that the motion moved by the member for Morialta be agreed to. Put that. Those in favour say aye. Those against say no. The noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells.
Oh, perfect. Thanks for that. Lock the doors. The question before the chair is that the motion be agreed to. Those in favour of the motion pass to the right of the chair. Those against pass to the left of the chair. I appoint the member for Moriata teller for the ayes and the Minister for Arts the teller for the noes. There being 11 ayes and 24 noes, the question therefore passes in the negative.